Alcatel phones have always generally been pretty good, but have they been truly great? Well, I'm not sure, but devices like the Alcatel 5 make me think there's potential here. Let's start with the way this thing looks, because it is kind of peculiar. You'll notice there's very little in the way of bezels around the sides and the bottom of the phone, but quite a bit up top, and that's because we've got a 13 megapixel dual camera setup here. One is your standard front-facing selfie shooter, and it does do a fairly decent job, but the real secret sauce is when you switch over into that wide angle mode. Now you can do that either manually, which I would recommend, or just see if the auto mode will do its trick. Basically, if you have more than 2 other people in the shot with you, it should kick into that wide angle mode automatically. It doesn't always work, but I have seen it work at least once, so your mileage may vary, and bear in mind, this is not quite done yet, so consider us cautiously optimistic about how this actually works. One of the weirder additions to the mix is what Alcatel calls its social mode, which kind of sounds more interesting than it actually is. Once you jump into this mode in the camera, you're able to, A, review the shot you just took while framing up your next one, but you can also create cool little collages and sort of photo booth style photo strips. There are a bunch on these devices, and I've seen a lot of my colleagues here in various stages of absurdity, so it's nice to see people letting go, even if it's in stuff like this. Around the back, we've got a 12 megapixel main camera, which has generally been a decent performer. It's not the most impressive thing you'll see this week by far, but we've gotten some pretty interesting shots out of it. There's a lot going on in this sort of beautiful Spanish terrace thing. Generally, photos have been crisp and bright. Exposure has been a little bit tricky, and the dynamic range isn't always great, but for the price that you should expect to pay for this thing, which is not a ton of money, yeah, you could do a whole lot worse. Beyond that, it is a relatively run-of-the-mill, upper-middle-class Android device. It runs a octa-core MediaTek processor with either 2 or 3 gigabytes of RAM, depending on where you're actually buying this thing. And yeah, it runs pretty quickly. I have a few complaints about it, and I think that really just speaks to the fact that phones in general, even from the mid-range, just feel dramatically different than they used to just a few years ago. You can buy a relatively inexpensive device like this and get a lot of great functionality and pretty solid performance without too many headaches. It's actually really impressive to see. I should also point out that with these dual cameras, you're able to do a pretty quick face unlock feature that Alcatel is calling Face Key. Sort of a strange name, but it does work surprisingly quickly. The way it works is it maps out 100 data points on your face and uses the camera to identify you. It's very similar to the approach that we saw on the OnePlus 5T last year, and it works almost as well. It's almost as fast, which, considering what we're working with here, is actually not a bad thing. When you go for less expensive mid-range devices like this, you sort of get the impression that companies are cutting corners, especially when it comes to things like the screen. That doesn't appear to be the case here. This isn't the most impressive thing that we've seen, but it's perfectly adequate. This is a 5.7-inch HD Plus display, which works out to something just a little bit bigger than your average 720p resolution, and I'm using it in surprisingly bright, hot Barcelona sunlight without too much trouble. I'm running at full brightness, but things are coming through with crispness and clarity, and even the colors are nice and punchy. Perfectly usable, and I think that speaks to the whole of this device all the way through. It's a perfectly usable phone, and actually in some ways it's a little bit charming, so actually, good job Alcatel. Ironically enough, if you're looking for the phone with the biggest screen here, it's actually not the Alcatel 5. It's actually this, the Alcatel 3V. It has a 6-inch full HD Plus display, which works out to, I believe, 2160 by 1080, so a little bit longer than your normal device. It also runs with an 18:9 aspect ratio, a trait that's shared by basically everything Alcatel is showing off of the show. It's really kind of a testament to the fact that here is this technology that we basically just saw in flagship devices last year, and now you can get them on the cheap. What feels less cheap than you might expect, by the way, is this. It's a 12 megapixel dual camera, and it's interesting because it's one of 2 implementations Alcatel is working on here. In the smaller, slightly less expensive Alcatel 3X, there's a dual camera meant for wide angle and telephoto use. So sort of traditional in the way you'd expect from a company like LG with their G series line. This dual camera is geared more towards depth, so you'll be able to jump in and take photos with a lot of bokeh. It doesn't always work particularly well. The software does, I think, overdo it a bit from time to time, but it does the trick relatively nicely, and it's going to be good enough for, I don't know, Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff that people care about but probably shouldn't. Alcatel has brought a lot of devices to Mobile World Congress 2018, But for once, I really feel like they're trying something new. They're really going after people who want flagship features in relatively inexpensive bodies, and I feel like I could probably pick one of these up and live with them for a while and really not feel like I'm missing out. Whether or not Alcatel does this better than the other phone companies we'll see at the show this year is another question, so stay tuned for a whole lot more.